Okay, it's good to have you at our session. This session has to deal with leadership to coincide with your studies in Timothy. And before we begin, there's two books that I believe will be very helpful as a starting point to read on leadership. There's a book by Robert Clinton called The Making of a Leader. And in this book, you will discover different stages and process for developing a leader. I use this quite often in some of my other leadership classes, and I'm recommending this book as a starting place to think about the process of developing young leaders. A second book that I want to present is this one by Wilkes called Jesus on Leadership. This particular book deals with the character of leadership analysis. It is an analysis of a variety of different passages in the scripture on leadership, particularly focus on Jesus with the disciple. And there's much here in developing the character of a leader. I recommend this one as well. Let me begin and continue on with identifying. My topic is on developing leaders by mentoring them. And a key verse for me is taken from 2 Timothy 2:2. It reads, "And the things you have heard from me say in the presence of many witnesses. Entrust to reliable men who will also be qualified to teach others." I consider that a key verse in raising leaders. It identifies a generational process. Paul speaking to Timothy, Timothy to reliable men, and then those men who can reach and qualify others. But let me begin by defining leadership, and of course I'm speaking about mentorship. Define it together. I find that across the city there are many pastors and youth leaders and others who are just feeling somewhat burned out because there aren't enough lay leaders to come alongside and support the ministry. They feel overburdened, there's a load. I've been at that place myself, and many times we ask, where are the other leaders? Where are they? There is obviously a lack of leadership in the church. There's a writer named Keith Anderson and Randy Reese. Together, they wrote a book on leadership and mentorship called Spiritual Mentoring. And in it, they define what a mentor is. And taking from the Greek mythology, they say that Ulysses had a son who he felt needed training. And so they identified a person whose name was Mentor. And this person, whose name was Mentor, was to provide an education of the soul and of the spirit, as well as of mind, and an education in wisdom and not merely in information. And from this Greek mythology, we get the idea and the concept of mentor. It is the root of that very word is connected to being a wise and entrusted counselor or teacher. And when I think about leadership development, especially about the leader himself, I see them as mentors. You come alongside someone and you're concerned not just simply with their formal training, their education, but their spiritual life and their soul. In addition, Clinton, in the book that I presented, The Making of a Leader, he said this, in the process of developing young men and women to leaders. He said it is the process where a person with a serving, giving, and encouraging attitude, the mentor, sees leadership potential in a still-to-be developed person, that is the protege, and is able to promote the otherwise significantly influence the protege along in the realization of that person's potential. Yeah, you come alongside someone and you help them in the process of their growth. Mentoring and leadership development is a process item, and it refers to that item where you take one person, one stage at a time, helping them to become the potential leader that they're supposed to be. Now, what follows in the rest of this particular lecture are some elements of leadership and mentoring. And I will identify some principles and some values that I believe, at least for me, they've been very helpful in developing young men and women into leadership positions in the church, some of which who have ended being church planters and youth pastors and other things. And there's 4 or 5 things specifically that I want to identify today. Number one, I really believe it's important to have a missional shift in our thinking about leadership and rethink about what is our mandate, our missional mandate in leadership development. Secondly, I think there's a refocus that we as leaders have to have regarding investing and transferring that particular missional mandate to the next generation. And thirdly, I believe that in developing leaders, we ought to call them to a God-sized mission, that they would recognize that they have a God-sized calling. I'll elaborate more on that at that point. Fourth, that the mentee, the one rising into leadership, needs to look beyond what I'm calling Christianity, that is spiritual formation Christianity 101, and it's taking on an advanced understanding and practice on their spiritual formation. And then lastly, I believe it's important that once we develop a leader, it may become important at the point to release them, not just only within our own church, so we release them to leadership, but releasing them even from our church to other ministries that are not directly connected to our particular ministry. So we as mentors, on the one hand, I'd like to just address that we have this particular calling upon our lives. Every believer is called to the mission. We identify it as the Great Commission. All of us are called to witness. All of us are called to spread the gospel. All of us have that understanding to go to the nations and make disciples of everyone. However, when I think about a leader, that is you as a mentor, myself as a leader, I think that our mandate is a little bit different. We have what I'm calling a transmission that's different than a commission, a transmission. The prefix trans means to go across, to go through. It is a crossing. It is a going beyond. And when I think about our missional mandate as leaders, it is to go beyond the Great Commission. To further illustrate that, or at least to further explain that, I find that when Paul was going from town to town in planting churches in his mission, he was involved in what we would call the commission, bringing people to Christ, the commission. Yet he also did something else when he planted and started these churches. From town to town, he as well identified elders in each one of these locations. And I see that as the transmission. That is, he understood that his calling was not just only to bring people to Christ and to develop disciples for Christ. His calling included establishing leaders. That's beyond just the identifying of disciples of Christ. That's a different element. I call it a transmission. And if we as leaders are to accept that challenge and dedicate ourselves to raising leaders, we leaders raising other leaders, then we will most likely have to overcome the malaise that is evident in so many young men and women and old men and women in our churches and our ministry. There is this book called The Missional Leader, written by Roxburgh and Romanuk. And they said this in their book called The Missional Leader. Without addressing the malaise among leaders and congregation, there will be little innovation in the missional life. The culture of belief and expectation in which these leaders and congregation are operating needs to be changed. And it really does seem to be evident. There's a malaise, there's a weakness, there's a lethargic temperament in so many people, not rising to the challenge of becoming leaders. There seems to be some kind of helplessness and maybe an unhealthy self-perception, an image that people are having of themselves. So if we as leaders need to understand that if we are to identify leaders, we have to address that issue of the malaise issue. If we have little expectation of raising quality leaders, most likely then that's what will happen. Low expectations often result in a lack of rising leaders. Let me just say something about expectations. Thomas Rainer wrote a book called High Expectations. And he analyzed and visited and spoke to over, I would say, hundreds of churches that were growing and tried to find what are some of the common elements that help these churches grow. And he writes that as a result of his investigation analysis, that effective assimilation churches have one primary characteristic that sets them apart from other churches, and that they do not keep their members in active involvement. That is, those churches that do not keep their members in active involvement compared to these growing assimilated churches. What was that single common characteristic of the growing churches? He says effective assimilating churches have high expectations of all their members. Expectation. When you expect people to rise up and you have a high standard or high bar, it is very likely that they will rise to the challenge. A leader like yourself or myself with a high expectation in God's power and God's plan to grow leaders will experience, and I have seen that in my life, will experience the result of having leaders rise up to those expectations. But if we set our standards and expectations low, inevitably people will rise up to that low expectation. High expectations do reap the results of raising higher quality leaders. The German poet Goethe said this: treat a man as if he already were what he potentially could be, and you make him what he should be. That's expectation. Expectation. Essential for rising leaders. Krallman, he wrote a book called Mentoring for Mission. And in it, he quotes a person named Goodwin, II. Goodwin saying this: people have a tendency to try to live up to the genuine expectations of persons whom they admire and respect. I guess my challenge at this moment is to think about, what do we expect from our ministry, from those that we're discipling, from the people within our church, especially for our leaders. We expect them to give 1% of their income. Are we expecting them to give 2-3 hours or less per week to ministry? What are we expecting from our leaders? Are we expecting them to sort of do devotional and have private times of in their devotional life? What are our expectations? If they are low, they will rise up to that low level. If our expectations are higher, then you will experience men and women rising to that particular challenge. High expectations are important to developing leaders. Another thing regarding leadership development and mentoring is, how do we imprint leadership values and the missional value in the next generation? How do we do that? In Psalms 78, verse 4 and 6, it says this: we will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, His power, and the wonders He has done. Verse 6, so the next generation would know them, that they would know them, even the children yet to be born, and they in turn will tell their children. You know, from these verses, I just gathered that there was this transmission, this imparting into generation after generation the wondrous things of God. I think in the same way that there needs to be within us the intentionality of implanting in the hearts of one generation after another generation the idea of rising up to leadership within our ministry. In October of 2003, I went to California and I met Dr. Bob O as a ministry with second-generation Koreans, 1.5, second-generation Koreans. And he said a startling thing to me and to many of us who were in a particular conference. He said, regarding the Korean church, he was speaking about the Korean church, he said, we are losing about 85% of our young adults. He went out to explain that in California, in his observation, that the young men and women who grew up in the church were going off to college, and 85% of them, after they get their education and career, do not return to the church. That's an incredible loss. It's an incredible loss. And as I think about that, it just made me think that a whole generation, well, we as leaders have not been doing very well in imparting into another generation the idea of missions, the idea of ministry, and the idea of leadership. And we're losing them. Gayla Postma wrote an article and identified in that article what David Kinnaman said, and I quote, "From high school graduation to age 25, there is a 42% drop in weekly church attendance. And by the age of 29, that drop increases to 59%. And she continued, despite strong levels of spiritual activity during the teen years, most 20-somethings disengage from active participation in the Christian faith during their young adult years. What's happened? We're losing a generation of people. And there is the imprint and the impression, the otherwise conveying into the hearts of another generation to enter into leadership and ministry is missing. We need this generational transfer of the praiseworthy deeds and the call to mission. It happened in the scriptures. Moses implanted this and he had his Joshua, and Elijah implanted and transferred the whole calling into Elisha, and we have Barnabas. I guess it wasn't too difficult to implant that into Paul. But Paul later worked with John Mark and Timothy, and this generational transfer of leadership and passion for ministry took place. I would challenge any leader who's watching this right now to embrace a young adult, one or two, and spend time with them. Have high expectation. Challenge them to rise up to the call to leadership. Embrace them. You've heard of the axiom, what you sow, you shall reap. That it is true, that if you invest into leadership, you will rise into leadership. It grieves my heart. I have an opportunity to hear many pastors identify the struggle of not having enough lay leaders in the ministry. And inevitably, I ask them the question, well, how are you spending time investing into a few to become specifically leaders? Not just to become good Christians and disciples. We want that, of course, but specifically imparting into another generation, one or two to start off with, for specifically to become leaders. And I find pastors say, well, I preach, I do a catechism class, I do counseling and administrate the church, and there's fundraising and there's capital campaign, and they go a list of things, but I find very few that say, I weekly meet with one or two or three or four or just a handful of people, and we intentionally focus on leadership practices and leadership principles. I find very few pastors who do that. Again, the axiom, what you sow, you shall reap. In the leadership process, the goal is not only that we would raise these mentees, these young leaders, to receive and to be taught. And we want to see practitioners come out of them. So let me give you a little bit of testimony of what I've done in my own personal life. And I've done this over and over again. And this has been my normal practice. I normally gather, and I love developing leaders in groups, 3 or 4, at times as many as 7 at a time. And I would meet with them for about 1.5 years. We would meet every week. And I remember one particular time where I challenged these young men who wanted to rise up to leadership at a very busy schedule. And I said, "You want to meet with me?" And they said, "Yes." And I said, "I want to meet with you." And the only time I had was to meet every Sunday morning at 7 o'clock. And we had a great time. Did not mess around. We were very serious. For 1.5 years, we met every Sunday morning at 7 o'clock. And we discussed primarily leadership principles, practices, and found that the majority of these young men were faithful to come every Sunday morning. In addition, I said, and if you want to meet with me, I said, your requirement is not only that you get here at 7 o'clock in the morning and do all your assignments, but I said, it's important that you identify another person that you will train, that you will disciple, that you will mentor. They could not be part of this leadership mentor relationship with me unless they had identified whom they were going to impart. Remember, this generational transfer of leadership principles and passion, I wanted them not only to receive it from me, but I wanted them to give to others. Generational transfer. Well, let me just transition to speak about a God-sized apostolic calling. 1 Samuel 14:14 says, "The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him leader of his people." It's identifying David, young David, who was a man after God's own heart. And the Lord sought one, and he found one in David. In Ezekiel chapter 22:30, it says this. The Lord says, "I looked for a man among them who would build up the wall and stand before me in the gap on behalf of the land, so I would not have to destroy it. But I found none." It's very tragic. The thing I want to address is having a God-sized calling. The calling is not a small matter. I've always been impressed that when God called so many of the people in the scriptures, how many of them responded and thought it was beyond their ability. They trembled at the calling. They trembled that God would identify them. Moses gave numerous excuses why he thought he was not qualified to take on that God-sized calling. Going to Egypt, bringing potentially more than 1 million people out of Egypt. A God-sized calling. It seems to me that it ought to be a God-sized calling that we present to people. Why? So that every individual who hears this would understand that it's going to take God to fulfill the calling. The apostles received a God-sized calling, a missional mandate from Jesus. He said in John 20:21, at his resurrection, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And they knew it was going to be a major assignment that they were receiving from Christ. And Christ knew it was a major assignment he was giving them, and that it was a God-sized assignment. So then the very next verse identifies that Jesus breathed on them the Holy Spirit, which they needed to fulfill their God-sized calling. It says, John 14:12, "Anyone who has faith in me will do what I have been doing. He will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father." Take a short digression from my lecture. I do this all the time. So the thought comes to me. These apostles are incredible men that we admire. We see them going off into the mission field, whether it's Peter, James, or Paul. We see the power manifestation in their lives. We see the discernment and we see them planting and starting churches. We see the conversion. We see the great growth. And people were coming in numerous numbers that were coming to Christ, devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking the bread. The massive growth. And we admire these leaders, these apostles. And we look up to them and we say, we want to be like them. I think that's a very good thing. However, the thought has been coming to my mind recently that if they were to do greater things in Christ, and they were in the beginning of experiencing the power of God, and we were in the at the beginning stages of the church in the first century, I began to think that these apostles, they had a desire for more. They understood that there was more yet, not only to do, but more to experience and more to have from God. So my thought comes to me, I wonder if these apostles were only in the beginning of their journey, of their growth, of their walk, and always realized there was yet more to have and receive and experience in their relationship with Christ and their mission. There was more to have. And I said, well, if they were in the beginning, then I thought, what about myself and other of us who are definitely not quite at all where these apostles were? If they were in the beginning, then we're the beginning of the beginning. We still have much to go and much to grow. God indeed has given them a God-sized calling. God has given us a God-sized calling as well, God-sized calling. And as instruments of God, we're called up and called out by God himself. Paul recruited Timothy, and he told Timothy this: do not hesitate to assign Paul. This is Paul saying about his work with Timothy. And it's actually, Sanders is saying this actually in his book, Spiritual Leadership, when he thinks about Paul and Paul's relationship to Timothy. Sanders says this, that when you think about Paul, Paul did not hesitate to assign Timothy tasks beyond his present powers. Listen, I just say, leaders, when you find a young man or a woman, we're very tempted to give them responsibilities and challenges within their ability to accomplish. There's wisdom in that. However, if we want to stretch them, you might want to consider giving them stuff that is a little bit beyond their abilities so that they grow up to the challenges. I think about young men and women in my church, in my ministry, who I have said, next Sunday you're going to preach with me. Just a couple of weeks ago, I said to the 2 youth leaders of my church, young men, have just barely any college experience, I've been in the youth ministry for about a year or so, have never preached in my church before, and I said to each one of them at a different point within a month's period, I said, one is named Ben. I said, Ben, next Sunday or in 2 Sundays from now, you're going to preach with me. We're going to do tag team. My desire was to challenge them. Can they grow? He rose up to the challenge. Did just a fine job. I did that the same thing with Matthew. I said, Matthew, you're going to preach with me as well. And it was a very fearful thing, but these 2 young men, as long as I did it with them, and we tag team side by side, they grew. That's what I'm just trying to say, that there's a need for us to give God-sized challenges and God-sized calling to these young men and women that God has brought before us so they rise up to those challenges. The calling to leadership is to follow after the footsteps of the apostles. We are forcefully advancing the purposes of God's kingdom in our communities and our cities, under the power of the Spirit, planting and starting new ministries in wherever God has called us to do. A couple of more points. In raising leadership, I really believe that we need to challenge them to walk in an advanced spiritual formation. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, "And we who with unveiled faces all reflect the Lord's glory, are being transformed into his likeness with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit." There's a need for transformation, spiritual transformation, growing from glory to glory, walking in sanctification. Psalm 27:4 says, "One thing I ask of the Lord, this is what I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple." When I consider the root causes of so much of the failure in leaders today, moral failures, I find that the root cause is often that they are disconnected, that is in character and love, in the heart level from Christ. They have lost their first love. And they have grown cold in their first love and their passion for God. And out of that weakness or that disconnect here, they stumble and they fall. There's more failures. They give up on ministry. Leaders are to advance. I really believe I had to live in an advanced stage in their spiritual formation and their spiritual disciplines and their practices. Robert Clinton, in the book that I identified earlier, The Making of Leaders, said, "At the heart of any assessment of biblical qualification for leadership lies the concept of integrity. That uncompromising adherence to a code of moral, artistic, and other values that reveals itself in sincerity, honesty, and candor, and avoids deception and artificiality." There needs to be a genuine integrity, a passion for God. What I'm identifying is the practice of spiritual formation that helps and enables someone to grow in their walk with God. It is, how can we tell someone to love God if we're failing to love God ourselves? How can we tell someone, pray, and we don't pray ourselves? So we challenge young men and women, and we come alongside them and just assist them to go beyond mediocrity when it comes in personal devotion and walk with God. I'll tell you, like myself, I've gone into the practice of fasting. In all honesty, weekly fasting, 24-hour fasting has become a normal practice, and I find it really very encouraging. And I will often in times challenge the young men and women with me, who I'm developing to lead, to do the same thing. And sometimes they make it till noon before they eat. It is not always easy, but this is just form of spiritual disciplines to develop our walk with God. But I find fasting to be an important element to elevate the sensitivity in the hearts of leaders towards God. Includes prayer and the other things. Advanced spiritual disciplines and practices are needed to develop a passionate heart within the leader, within them for God. This vertical passion for an ongoing daily relationship with Jesus will transform them more than any other discipline, more than any other practice that they can learn in a classroom. In the first, as you know, the first and greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Only as a young leader daily practices and daily gazes into the face of Jesus will he experience the radiant, sanctifying power of Christ. Leadership development, it must include intellectual challenges, theological understanding, growing in their understanding of doctrine, skills, how to preach, how to lead a small group, how to develop a small group, how to disciple. It needs to include those things. However, in the end, they must adopt a passionate, disciplined love for Christ. This is number one. to gaze and behold Christ. Just one more thing. When I think about spiritual development, lastly, I want to say is, you know, when you raise someone and they've adopted a passion for Christ, they've understood, they have adopted the idea of the leadership, they're even discipling others into leadership. They've accepted a God-sized calling, you see them growing. Why are we doing all of this? Well, we're doing it in order to release them. At some point, we need to do like Paul, to say to Timothy, okay, you become the pastor, or you become the youth leader. You start another movement. You do, releasing them to leadership roles in the church. I'll give you my personal testimony. 1991 or so, God brought a young man to our church, John. After about 4 years, he just fell in love with Jesus quickly, fell in love with the Lord. He was an evangelistic heart. And he was one of those that the Lord permitted him to come be part of the training, the leadership training. Faithful worker. And as I said, an evangelist. And after several years, he became our youth pastor. Did a great job, just grew the ministry. And after doing that for about 5 years, now he's been with us 10 years, he felt a passion to become and to start a church. I thought it was great. Thought we need more churches. So we released him with almost 30 people from our church. Go start a church. And he's growing that church. I just want to say at this point today, he is now the pastor of the church I started. He's my senior pastor. I think it's important to release the young men and women who are trained to become leaders, even to the point where they rise above you. I have no problems. He's in that God-sized calling, functioning in the place that God has for him. John R. Mott believed, this is a quote coming from Sanders' book, Spiritual Leadership. He says about John R. Mott, believed that leaders must multiply themselves by developing young leaders, giving them full play and adequate outlet for their abilities. Young people should feel the weight of heavy burden, opportunity for initiative, and power for achievement. Foremost, they must be trusted. Blunders are the inevitable price of training leaders. They won't make mistakes. Stay with them. Raise them up. So in conclusion, I've tried to identify that we have a missional mandate that goes beyond the commission. The commission is go into all the world and make disciples. I think leaders are called to do that, but more. We're not just called to make good Christians, disciples. We're called to make leaders. That's a totally different level. It's really a higher level. So pastors and leaders and whoever's listening, make leaders, not just make good disciples. A good leader will be a good disciple, but they will acquire much more. So we have a transmission that goes beyond the commission. We are to implant in the hearts of those leaders the passion for leadership. That's this transformation, this missional transformation. Paul told Timothy, find reliable men who can teach others. Find reliable men. Transmit into their heart this calling for mission. And as you're raising them, have high expectations of them. Go ahead and give them God-sized assignments. Come alongside them, encourage them, be with them, but make sure you give them God-sized assignments and have high expectations, because they will rise up to that and you'll end up having what you sowed. You sowed high expectation, come alongside them, and you will reap that. Finally, be diligent to come alongside them, to train them in passionate, devotional, integrous walk before God. They'll stumble. They'll fall. but stand with them, and you'll rise high quality leaders for your ministry and for the world. Thank you.